So at this point, you have finished all of your drawing from observation and you're ready to add color. The materials that I have here for use today, I have markers. I also have a box of crayons. I have a little cup of clean water and a paintbrush. I have a paper towel. And then a material that you may not have, but if you do, you could use it, would just be some little watercolor cakes. If you don't have these though, these will do the trick. We are going to be adding color to these, and we're going to use a process. Well, I should say, if you have these materials, this is a process you can do. If you don't have these materials, you just have color pencils or crayons, and you want to add color in a different way, that's perfectly fine. This is just one way of doing this. I'm going to start off with crayons, because crayons and watercolor materials, which you might be curious why I held markers up when I said watercolor, but I'll show you in a minute. Crayons do a really cool thing when you try to mix watercolors with them. They will resist those watercolors. They will say, no watercolors, I am crayon, I am made of wax, which is oil-based, and I will resist you. I will not let you be here because I am here and I am crayon, so I will resist you. So this is a pretty cool process that you could do with this project, where you work with your crayons first to add some color, and then you can add some watercolor over top. But again, some of you may be saying, I don't have watercolor, so what can I do if I don't have watercolors? And that's where those markers are going to come in. I'm going to first, before I show you the markers and what you can do with them, I'm going to add some crayon to this leaf. Now I am pressing fairly hard with my crayon. That's a key here with the watercolor resist, is you do want to have some pretty heavy crayon lines put down, or crayon coloring put down. If you just color very lightly with your crayon, it doesn't tend to be, I should say, strong enough to really resist that watercolor. And I'm sticking with trying to use mostly fall colors or natural colors. Alright, so I'm adding my crayon pretty heavy on here, all wherever I want it to be. I don't have to have it everywhere. I just want it to go into some areas. And when I finish adding my crayon, I will go on to the next step. Once you've finished adding your crayon, if you're choosing to add some watercolor, you can move on to that. If you're working with watercolor cakes, then you're just going to make sure you activate that watercolor cake by adding some clean water to it and stirring until that paint gets nice and mixed in with the water, and there's a kind of a little puddle in the bottom of the cake, so it's activated and ready to use. And then when you paint this watercolor on top of your leaves, anywhere that you added crayon, the watercolor will resist, or actually no, that's wrong. The crayon will resist that watercolor so that you can still see the crayon design that you added to your natural object. That is one choice. Now, if you do not have watercolors and you have been very curious about why I have markers, I'm going to show you how you can use markers as watercolors. Washable markers, because they're washable, they're water soluble, which means you can use them just like you would use watercolor paint. So I'm going to take this red marker here, and I'm going to add some red watercolor paint to this leaf. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start off first by just coloring with the marker. Now I'm not coloring a space all the way in. I'm going to go ahead and switch colors so you can really see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'll use yellow again. All right, so I'm adding a yellow line and just a little bit of yellow pigment by coloring this yellow marker in around my crayon. Now, just like watercolor paint, the crayon is not going to allow my marker to cover it up because it is resisting the marker the exact same way that it resists the watercolor paint. So I've added some yellow lines in here, and then I can take my paintbrush and my cup of clean water, and I can just go ahead and paint that space in, and as I touch that yellow marker, because it's washable and it's water soluble, the water will change it and drag it around. It'll take that yellow color from that marker and drag it around that space to fill it in. Now remember, in this space I did some red marker, so that's dragging that red around. Now another thing you might be curious about, you only have a couple of colors to work with. That doesn't give you a whole lot of variety, and perhaps you want a little bit more variety. Maybe you want to try to make kind of a golden color for one of your leaves. Well, here's how you can do that. Finish this guy up. If you want to mix colors, you're able to do that by taking like a little piece of tin foil or a little piece of plastic wrap, or even a paper plate that has kind of that waxy coating. And if you take your marker and color onto that surface, I've got like a little circle of yellow right here, and it's not filling it in, but it's adding a little bit of marker onto that space. And then I could take a little bit of orange. Well, you can see that much better. And I put it right next to that yellow. So I've got yellow here and I've got orange here. And then I can take that clean paintbrush and I can stir them together to make a new color. Okay? And then I can use that new color to paint, just like I would use watercolors to paint in areas. As you're finishing up adding colors, you can always feel free to layer as well. If you don't have a color quite the way you want it, or maybe you want it to be a little bit brighter, you can go back onto it and add more. Now, while it's wet, if I tried to color onto it with a marker, it's not going to be very good for the marker. So if I wanted to add marker, I would want to make sure that I was using this method of coloring onto something else, and then using my paintbrush to add that color. The other thing is, if you just can't quite get a color right, it's just not, you know, the color that comes in the marker just isn't quite what you feel like you want or need, don't be afraid of mixing the colors together on your surface to get the color that you need. On this little piece of tin foil right here, I've got green and I've got red, not red, green and yellow, and I've got a little bit of brown that I'm going to try mixing together. So as I mix the green and the yellow, I come up with kind of a lime green, yellow green, spring green color. But then when I mix that little bit of brown in, it turns far more like earthy rather than being quite so bright, which is exactly what I was hoping for this particular leaf. I didn't want it to be super bright green. I didn't really want it to be brown either. I just wanted it to be a nice deep green, and I achieved that by not being limited to the colors the way they come, but by mixing them together. So as I finish this one up, the next step is to get these leaves cut out. The best, or one of the best tricks that I can give you for doing that is not to try to cut them out while you're dealing with this whole big sheet of paper, but instead cut around them. So go ahead and just cut out around each of your leaves, and then just, or sticks or rocks or whatever natural objects that you're working with, and then just put that off to the side. All right, So cutting out around your objects so that you just get a little bit closer to your leaves for cutting them out. Now the next step for cutting, I'm not going to try to go ahead and cut out right up against my leaf right now. Instead, I'm going to cut so that my scissors touch the edge or like the corners of all of my little parts of my leaf. So I'm still just getting rid of that extra paper. This is a great scissor tip. All right, so now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces to still cut out. I'm gonna follow along the edge of this line that I wanted to cut. And if you're like me, if you went outside of your lines, it's not a big deal because now you can just cut out those mistakes. If I try to take my scissors and turn them, my paper wants to bend kind of weird and it's a little hard for me to see what I'm doing. So instead of bending my paper like that, I'm gonna go ahead and take my scissors out and start again, cutting from this direction. And that way when I get to the middle where those two cuts meet up, my little piece pops right out and I've done a nicer job of cutting without bending my paper up. So again, I'm just gonna cut right along the edge of this one. But I'm not going to try to turn and keep cutting because that's not great for my artwork. I'm going to rotate my paper and cut along the next edge until that piece falls out. And I'm going to keep doing that with all of my leaves until I've got them all cut out. Coming to the end of cutting out my last leaf, and I just wanted to show that technique to you one more time where you just use the idea of cutting multiple sections out. So like for this little section right here, I'm going to cut down until I get to that corner, and then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut down again to take that little section out. And then the same thing here in this last little part where I just finished cutting out my leaves. So now I've got my leaves all colored and cut out and ready for the next